I'm a design engineer who works at a company called NAN. We do automation, workflow software, and AI automation software. But I also co-found a small little side project startup with my friend Dave called Cushion, which is a async kind of Slack alternative, if you like, for lack of a better word. Mostly used by small teams or design teams to get design review feedback on things. And this talk is called The Future of Work. Originally, on the list it was called The Future of Work as Async, because I wrote this talk about mid last year, particularly about asynchronous working when I was working on my side project, and how remote work has massively changed things for a lot of people, and how it changes how we all communicate and what things you see in companies of how people are communicating with each other. But so much has happened, particularly around joining an AI company specifically, and in the last 6 or 8 months I think it warrants a little bit of scope, so I've just chopped the kind of end off it so it's a little bit sort of wider. But this talk isn't about predictions. I'm not going to just keep going on about how you're all going to be made redundant in 6 months if you don't get on to doing coding agents, or I'm not going to sit here going, it's all bullshit, it's a massive conspiracy. I think we're all exhausted. Anyone who spends any time reading or on social media about people making predictions about, you must do this and buy my course, otherwise you're not going to make it, or you must use this product that I happen to work with, otherwise you're not going to make it. Because particularly in the last 5 months, and moreover probably in the last 5 years, I think the software industry has been massively chaotic. Probably more, I've been working here about nearly 12, 15 years, and it seems way more chaotic now than it was when I started, at least. Tools have changed, markets have changed, how we communicate and work with each other have changed, jobs have changed. So I'm not going to try and make any predictions, but I'm just going to showcase a few changes that I'm seeing already that I think, at least in my opinion, set the tone for the rest of the decade. So even though I'm not making predictions, I just lied, I am probably making predictions. But to talk about the future, I want to recap the past a little bit. So taking you all the way back to 2020, during the COVID pandemic, we all got told we had to get used to kind of what was called the new normal. That our entire society changed overnight. Standing here in 2026 now, it tells me basically two things. One, how fucking amazingly magical vaccines are, to be honest. And two, how even at the time when the future seems massively uncertain, it feels like everything's completely thrown up in the air. Things have a way of working themselves out. And even if we come out the other side where things have kind of changed a little bit forever, things are going to be all right. But something interesting also happened in 2020. It was the start of what we call the ZERP or the era, or the free money era, it's sometimes called. Basically, this is when interest rates were at near or close to zero, and that meant venture capital funding and capital expenditure skyrocketed because for very high net worth individuals or investment funds, it made more sense to spend their money taking lots of risky bets rather than investing in things because essentially money was free. And this led to a massive boom in the tech industry. Not only this, like the difference between how the tech industry was and how the rest of the world was really, really stark. One of my friends that I was talking to who don't work in the tech industry, while they were worried about being laid off or being put on furlough, every week my friends who do work in the tech industry and myself were getting inundated by recruiters saying there's new roles, do you want to change roles? I've got a new role you might be interested in. Because because everyone was locked in, the only thing people could spend money on were things like ordering things off Amazon, scrolling on Facebook all day, spending money on ad spend and things like this. But like a lot of pendulum swings, everything swings back, and around 2023, the pandemic subsides, and big tech companies especially, but also that filters down to the smaller, medium-sized ones and startups, start making huge layoffs. Amazon, Google, Meta, some of the more like high-interest ones. Interestingly, a few, like probably about maybe 6 or so months before this, like ChatGPT launches, and kind of the idea of LLMs become mainstream to people. And then fast forward all the way to Christmas last year, this kind of cute little thing that people were playing with, ChatGPT, has now become this behemoth of coding agents, which, at least depending on like how your company is structured and things like this, have massively thrown a lot of what people think about software development into flux, massively made people kind of scared about what the future is like and what the future of software development is. And then going up all the way up to I think about roughly a couple of months ago in 2026, OpenAI announced the biggest investment round probably I think ever, which was $110 billion from SoftBank. So in less than that 5 years from like then up until just recently, we've seen a massive hiring boom, record layoffs, investment become massively free, completely dry up, and then come massively back again if you run an AI company. So basically, what's going on? Where does this leave us now, and why does everything kind of feel chaotic? That every single time you look at any sort of tech news or any sort of thing that's going on, why does everything feel like it's changing all the time? But just like the COVID pandemic, everything feels chaotic. Eventually, things start to subside and things start to become a bit more normal and a bit more the way you sort of do things. And the rest of the talk is about those changes that personally I've seen in the companies that I've worked in over this time of the last 5 years, and some of the things I'm seeing around all my peers and people else in the tech industry. Oh no, they're not. Yes, they've animated. Brilliant. See, because I'm a designer, instead of making a really cool demo like Oliver did, I spent hours trying to do this to make it look really good. It's typical of designers, right? So I haven't got an actual demo today, it's just me talking. So the 4 things I think that kind of sum this up, I've put into sort of sections, which is distributed teams, smaller teams, AI agents, and being focused. And I'll just talk to each one of these individually. First being distributed or remote, if you kind of want to call it that. Remote work, I think, in my opinion, was one of the great gifts of the pandemic, if you can describe it that way. During the pandemic, employers had to reluctantly let us all work from home, right? And for a lot of people, that was a very new experience, both for whether you're how to manage a team, you run a company, or you work on a team. I was lucky enough to work at Mindera before that, which we've been remote since day dot. So the transition was a little bit easier for us who've been working that way, as like a lot of people in the tech industry. But it was very hard for a lot of companies to adapt to that. There's a lot of stories, especially at the start of that time, where people were having all-day Zoom meetings because there's no way anyone could do any work unless some people were looking at them. So they're trying to recreate the office by just having people's cameras on all the time. And people like managers struggling to understand what their job is and actually what they actually do all day if they're not being able to have 5-minute chats with everyone all the time. And since the pandemic subsided, it's become very, very hard for companies to kind of take that back completely. There's obviously return to office kind of campaigns and things, but generally speaking, hybrid work has become a bit of the new normal. I was talking to someone earlier, and people trying to push return to office usually means a lot of the best staff kind of want to leave, because they feel like if I'm not appreciated, I don't get the benefits of remote working here. It's kind of seen as like a benefit that some people really want and kind of expect. During that time of people going remote, we saw a lot of people completely change how they work. We saw a lot of people, including myself, leave places like London and go, well, I want to move back closer to my family now, because why should I have to live in an expensive city to work somewhere when all I need is my laptop? Why can't I live next to my family? Why can't I live in the countryside? Even though companies kind of a lot of companies kind of want to kind of push against that, it's now become kind of a bit of a standard, especially in our industry. So depending on what your own personal preference is, whether you think, oh no, I actually prefer being in office, or actually I don't. I personally think the companies that embrace remote working, whether that be all in on it or go for hybrid, have a huge advantage. One of those things is the motivation. So there's study after study after study after study that shows people are generally relatively more productive and more interesting, a lot less stressed and a lot less susceptible to burnout and job switching if they work remotely. There's plenty of different reasons for this, but not having to commute, being able to care if you've got childcare, not having to pay expensive childcare, being able to be at home with your family, spend more time with them, instead of at lunch having to sit with Greg from sales chewing your ear off, you can go and take your child to the park or take your dog for a walk. There's a lot more like human element to being able to work from home, and it gives people a lot of benefits, which means their job feel a lot more pleasurable. Another thing more practically is global talent. It's very almost mathematically impossible that the best people for your team and your job just happen to live 20 or 10 miles away from your office. Global remote companies can hire based on pure talent and skill and fitness for the role, not the geography of the location. I'm talking about the company I work at, NAN, is based in Berlin, but we hire all across the world. And I've been able to, even in the last few months I've worked there, I've seen some of the best engineers I've ever seen. and they all live in completely different countries. Some are in Ireland, some are in India, some are in Bosnia, some are in America. They're located all over the place because you can pick the people who are best for the job. It doesn't matter really where they work if your company's set up to do that. And more interestingly, I think it gives teams that also adopt AI a huge structural advantage. Being remote and naturally a bit more asynchronous has its challenges, which means there's a lot more communication skills that you tend to need. If you're talking to someone and working with somebody, you might not always be able to get questions straight away because maybe that person is on a completely different time zone, maybe they're asleep, maybe they're away from their desk. You can't just go and tap them on the shoulder. But this encourages companies to think and communicate in a slightly different way, where you give a lot more context up front and basically assume that every time you communicate with someone, I can't just assume all this stuff. I have to give them a lot more context so someone can read this in isolation and understand exactly what I need, what feedback I need to move forward, what things are blocking me, and when the deadline of this project is, so on and so forth. Turns out this is exactly the sort of way you want to talk to LLMs, right? You need to give them really good written communication, really good context. You can't assume things. You can't go, well, it will know what I mean when I say this, because no, it won't. So the teams that already have these skills and have done this kind of almost self-documentation, I think have a huge, massive advantage using AI agents than ones that can just copy and paste a Slack message and hope it understands what you're trying to fucking talk about. So companies of all sizes have distributed teams, from like smaller companies like relatively NAN, there's about 300 of us, to 37 Signals, which have been a remote company for 25 or so years, and there's about 100 of those people, all the way up to Spotify, which has thousands of people all over the globe, or GitLab, or so on and so forth. I think having talked to people at the company I'm working, and also a couple of people at these companies, the skills of being able to work remote have been a massive thing they've looked in for new hires as well. So being able to communicate with people of different time zones, different countries, and different cultures is a key strength. It's not just something that you just expect to do. Being able to find people who are self-motivated and people who aren't going to get blocked because someone they need isn't online, they can kind of move and keep going, is a massive advantage, which obviously, if all else being the same, is going to help you when you're working in remote settings. But the other thing that you see as well is smaller teams. So since those hiring boom days that we talked about, companies are kind of being asked to do more with less. And one of those things that they're less of typically is headcount. So here's like a graph. This is from the US, but I think the parallels with the UK and the EU are quite similar, basically. You can see here, like when COVID starts, these are job postings for software development things. See this massive peak of the COVID during the peak of COVID and zero interest rates era, and then obviously starts to come down. If you cut off this graph and go up, you can see a little tiny tick up just in like the last year. And it's easy to look at kind of these graphs, but actually understanding what it was like. So I joined during 2020. I was at a company called Lantern, and we did healthcare software for the NHS. And I joined as head of design. There was no design team at the time. They just used contractors. And on my first day, instead of I knew nothing about the product, I knew nothing about the team, I basically knew who the CTO was who hired me. The first thing I was to do was like, right, you need to go build a design team of like easy 6 to 10 people. And this is because like also part of their funding as part of it was one of the biggest things the investors have to ask them is like, okay, who are you going to spend this money on hiring? How many engineers are you going to have? How many designers are you going to have? The highest priority task was how big you're going to grow, essentially, and how ambitious your goals were. The reality of the last few years, in my experience, has been quite different. Since those days, you can see job postings have obviously declined, layoffs has increased, especially job postings for juniors especially has massively declined, and even any applications we've seen, especially for entry roles, triple in some cases. Everyone knows someone, or probably is somebody, who's applied for jobs where they've had hundreds and hundreds of applications and kind of heard nothing. It's quite a tough time in certain places out there. But what runs parallel to this is expectations from investors, right? So I was talking about when I was at Lantern, when I'd read what investors wanted or was privy to conversations, it was all about big ambitious growth, how headcount was like a huge thing of what that money was spent on. Since then, when I've been in conversations towards the end of that time, sort of 2023, 2024 onwards, now, a lot of it's more about proving path to profitability, right? So if you're not profitable as a startup, the first thing investors want to know is like, how are you going to start making money? even though we're just going to give you a bunch of runway, but how are you going to start making money, rather than thinking about how many hundreds of engineers you're going to hire. So it's kind of obvious that teams have been asked to do more with less. So NAN, the company I work with, is a great example of that. I think it was the end of last year, we raised 235 million on a Series C. But whereas that maybe 5 years ago would have meant like, okay, we're going to go and spend that on engineers. And don't get me wrong, we are hiring people across loads of different roles. But internally, we've committed to keeping the company under 500 people, which when like I heard that, it kind of feels a bit mad when you think about it. When I was a contractor, I've worked at companies that had almost like teams that were like half the size of that. Because most of that money, when you think, well, what's all that money being spent on? Most of that money is being spent on capital invested in runway, especially working on AI things. The runway needs to be a lot longer because there's a lot more experimentation, and also AI expenditure. So teams are being asked to do a lot more like as smaller teams with less headcount. But I actually think there's quite a really interesting dynamic and actually quite a good thing in a certain thing. At NAN we have these thing called tiger teams, which is a bit of a lame name, but essentially what they are really, really small product teams, around 4 to 5 people, mostly engineers, like one designer, maybe a PM that crosses like 2 of them. And they're essentially, there's no tickets, there's no sprints, there's no scrum, there's none of that bullshit. Like basically, you're given one goal and a deadline, like for example, like we're going to refit this product in this way, and we're going to like look at it by this point. And the goal there is to essentially build a proof of concept or an MVP, and they're basically off you go. Right? This is like relatively uncommon, like in companies I've worked in before. Like you usually have a large product team where you'd have a lot of like planning throughout the entire year, and then you break those things into quarters, and then you break those quarters into like sort of segments, and then the segments into tickets, and then plan through those and loads of sprints. What's great about this is you have the speed of being able to move with just a few people, but obviously you would think like, well, the downside of that is, well, how do you actually get enough done if there's only a couple of you? One of the things that we've actually seen work for us quite well is to use AI agents as collaborators, not to do most of like the key coding or any sort of greenfield type stuff, but help with the heavy lifting. So being able to onboard new people really, really quickly, help with maintaining test coverage, help with like code review and things like this. Is massively using those kind of productivity gains to massively speed these things up has allowed us to have these really, really small teams to essentially, one of our initiatives is to completely retrofit a lot of our product areas, and the speed that they're able to move at is actually incredible. So that takes me on to the next thing. The adoption, at least in the companies I've worked in, of AI agents has been insane. So like probably about a year ago, I worked for a company that did algorithmic insurance software, and maybe there was a couple of us who were like messing around with things like full code and stuff. Before I joined NAN, the company, even though we're technically an AI company, the use of that was quite minimal. Since like Christmas over now, I'd say I'm probably one of the few people in the entire company who still writes like code by hand. So like pretty much everyone in the company, they're still involved. No one's just like, giving something to their agent saying make no mistakes and then going off and like going down the pool all day. But like pretty much everyone is using AI agents in pretty much every single part of their work. And whether you like it or not, whether they're always successful or not, whether they always write good code or not, I think like agents are going to be just part of like what we expect of the software industry now. And I think some of the productivity gains when used correctly are pretty obvious to see. So for me personally, Coding Agents has completely changed how I do stuff. This is just a screenshot of like the last thing that I did. I think this was like a couple of days ago. This is a terminal coding agent called OpenCode, which is a really, really good open source project. It's a bit like if you use Claude Code, it's like that, but you can use any model on it. And it's really, really well maintained. And I think there's a million different ways you can use them, some good, some bad. And personally, I find them brilliant when I'm doing things like research, or I'm trying to, like when I joined the company I joined, I've always coded in React, but they moved into Vue.js, and being able to just ask things like, here's how I would do this in React, how does that map to Vue.js, has massively just made things so much easier, where probably in the past I would have to sit there and write things out, get things wrong, look through the documentation. I've now just got someone who can just do that for me. But then again, as we'll see in some of the data I'm going to show in the next slide, they're not always like useful, and the sort of lure of being able to like let them loose on things and not check what they're doing is very, very high. So this is from a company called DX, who do like development surveys, mostly in the US and EU, but like again, I think like the data from what I've read at least like feels resonant to me. So this was from last quarter. This was Q4 2025, so it's quite recent. So they found when they looked at 1,000 different companies of all shapes and sizes, that roughly on average 22% of their code in those companies were being authored by AI. So that's just whether there's probably still a human involved in that, obviously at some point, but it's been like the Git commits were attributed to AI agents. On average, the developers there who are using it are saving about just over 4 hours a week than before when they didn't. They're doing about 60% more PRs than devs not using AI. And the reduction in boarding time is roughly about 50%. And like I said, that last one I can attest to myself. Like I've been able to get up to speed on completely new, quite heavy, large code base really, really quickly. And I attribute that almost completely to be able to use agents to do research for me. But there's some positives, but it's not without drawbacks. So what they've also seen in that same survey, and also what I've personally seen, is code maintainability is very spotty. Some companies say that their maintainability has been absolutely fine. Some companies say that they can actually track customer incidents directly to AI usage, and there's been some quite high profile cases of that. In one case, an AWS outage that they internally tracked to some AI agent code room. So the more higher throughput you would think from agents means the higher risk of code maintenance. Also, writing faster code doesn't always mean translate to impact, right? There's a very hard, no one's been really able to draw a straight line between we started using AI agents, therefore our customers are happier, or our revenue has increased, or we've had this kind of business, we've met this business KPI. There's kind of a bit of a false misconception drawn between those two things. And most importantly, those time savings don't always translate into quality improvements. So just because you can save 4 hours a week doesn't mean that person is spending that 4 hours a week making that thing really, really perfect. When maybe years ago you wouldn't have time to do all the things you wanted to do. You always ship stuff and you think, oh, it's not quite as good as I make it, but I run out of time. Now being given time, you've not really seen all those things, people go back and fix all those things. What we're really seeing is someone going, well, now I can ship 2 pretty crappy things rather than 1 pretty crappy thing, right? And the problem is that risk of shipping that kind of semi-crappy thing is much, much higher because it's so quick and easy and cheap to get there. Which takes me on to the next one, and probably the most important one. The companies that I think like leverage all these things, and the teams that seem to do, I think will do massively well, and the people that can work in this way can massively well. But I think this last one is like what almost separates the wheat from the chaff. So this is, I'm not expecting you to read all this, right? And you probably can't at the back. But this was like a tweet from somebody who's actually the maintainer on that open code, the terminal project that I was using. And obviously making a coding terminal product, they use AI agents all the time to write all that stuff. Well, this is an internal message they posted publicly, basically saying that it's so easy. In fact, I'll just read out the first line actually. First problem, like shipping features are not worth shipping. It's pretty easy to prompt a new feature into existence, so naturally the bar for what ship drops. But this shouldn't be the case. It should remain high, and we should think very hard about features and if they're worth it or not. Don't make these decisions solo. Talk to people who run the company. I think this really sums up, like, in my experience, like some of the dichotomy between like the benefits and sort of the drawbacks. It's so easy to make something into existence now, and it's not just engineers. Like on that DX survey, the adoption of AI agents from designers and PMs was roughly about just over 60%, and in N8N, we've been using them all the time for prototyping and for proof of concepts and things like this. So it's so easy to make something realistic, but it's really hard for not to get to that point where you're almost 80% there and not want to just go, yeah, that's good enough, I'm going to throw it over. But AI just kind of 10x's that kind of effort that you put into. It just makes things 10 times easier. It doesn't make your ideas any better. It doesn't tell you what is worth shipping or what isn't worth shipping. It doesn't help you get uncritical feedback on like, actually, only you think this idea is any good. Maybe you shouldn't do this for a number of reasons. In fact, it really just makes that harder. And this is something that like we've found a lot on my side project that I mentioned earlier called Cushion, where like we started off as being like kind of an asynchronous kind of way to communicate, and all the people that use us, including myself and Dave who run it, and all the small amount of customers that we've got, have all started using it a lot more for getting feedback on things, particularly feedback on AI prototypes, right? Because one of the problems is, like I said, it's very easy just to make something and go, yeah, that's good enough, I'm just going to throw it out there. But the bar for actually whether you should or not requires you to get feedback and think about these things really deeply. It's very difficult to do that in the current paradigm of how we do things, whether that be sharing something on Slack or just hoping that it's good enough or hoping that someone catches something in a code review, because by the time you get to that point, it's almost like feels like it's ready, you don't want to block these things. So we've kind of like thought about our products as a way for people to explore ideas and share these feedback on these things that they're building and try and think a little bit more deeply and use all the time and productivity savings that we're promised by AI tools to actually use it to actually do the thing that they can't do as well as us, which is think about things and be creative and really think deeply about the things that we're building. So I think like just to sum up like why these changes can kind of feel a bit jarring, they can feel a bit like, I don't know if that's really how things are going to work. I'm kind of worried maybe potentially that like AI is going to make it really hard for me to move to my next job. I think the opportunities definitely outweigh the challenges. Like I said, I've been building like software for like 12 to like 13 years or something, and I've never really known an easier time to actually just get started with things. The side project I mentioned, Cushion, me and my co-founder Dave built it part-time, just both of us. Neither of us are like full-time devs really, we're just designers who can code, and the only way we've been able to feel confident enough to do that is because of the fact that we can kind of do research and we can kind of get AI agents to help us with stuff. Yeah, probably 70% of it we've thrown away because it's utter shit, but like it's actually allowed us to be able to move to these things where probably previously we would have think there's no way we could do that, we're never going to have the time to do it. So I think if you kind of ignore a lot of the hype that people say, you ignore a lot of the fear and uncertainty, there's a lot of these things that I think if you adopt them, give you a lot of good opportunity and chance for learning and have fun experimenting with things. So, yeah, thank you for listening.
Way before 8, so we've got plenty of time for some Q&A. Nathan?
Yeah, can I ask about the tiger teams?
Yeah.
So I think I've seen more bad examples of Scrum being implemented in teams than I have good. And if I reflect on it, I think early in my career it was a really good framework to work in as a junior, to have these structured meetings where you knew the point of the conversation was and you could have a space to ask questions and develop. But then I think maybe the more I become more confident and more skilled, it's become less useful. So my opinion has completely changed, and I really find that quite attractive as an idea. But do you think it's that to work in a team like that with less structure requires a certain personality? That's my question one. And question two is, would juniors thrive in that? From your experience?
Yeah. I think to answer the last one, juniors thrive that. Part of me would say no, but then I haven't been a junior for like 10 years. So I don't, my memory of what being a junior was like, I remember being a junior as in like, I would have thrived being like, yeah, I can do it. I mean, I would have been wrong. Like, but I was absolutely, my arrogance outweighed my skill at that point, and probably still arguably does maybe. But like, I was much more hungry to like get something wrong and learn. But I imagine yes, it would be difficult for a short answer. The first one, yes, I think it does suit a certain type of personality. But I think my point is like, I think at least the companies that I have worked with or like have friends who work with who see these similar things happening, I think companies will index on hiring for those people. Especially with designers, I've noticed. I speak to a lot of people who are designers who are very frustrated because they can't find jobs because And when they do, they talk to people and they're trying to put around, well, I'm trying to show them the design process. First I did this and I did this, and they're just not interested. Because what I think a lot of companies are looking for at the moment is like, that's great, but we want someone who can take, in brutal honesty, the PM's shitty vibe coded thing and be like, just fix all the stuff on it, because they've already thought about it, but they want to move at 100 miles an hour. So yeah, I think there's a certain type of personality and there's a certain type of skill. I think my point is like, I'm not trying to say if you're not like that, you'll never work again. But like, there's definitely some sort of like benefit to thinking about these things as a skill to learn, rather than thinking like, oh, everything will always work in these same ways. So yeah, I suppose yes to both, I think.
Pushing it straight away.
Yeah, looks sick, right? I like it.
So on the distributed side, I mean, there's been a concerted effort, especially among large employers, to kill that off, really. AWS quite infamously asked everyone to come back in 5 days a week. So, and large employers I've talked to, they're all shifting back to a office-first approach. So how do you really control that with your points?
Yeah, and I suppose it does bias mostly to startups because it's my background. But I think, like, at least from what I've spoke to who's worked in companies where that's been the case, it's been a massive negative. I've not spoke to any senior designer or engineer who's been asked to return to office and been like, fucking brilliant, thank you. I've been waiting to come back to the office and commute 2 hours a day, and it's always been like they're begrudgingly done. So I think my point is not necessarily that, oh, obviously everyone sees how brilliant this is, but the fact is that the genie can't be put back in the bottle now. And I think if you're, if you know your worth and you're a senior person with a lot of experience and things like this, you're gonna basically demand that, like, well, I want to work remote or I want to work hybrid. I know I do. Like, I just like flat out have turned down people's like roles from recruiters or headhunters. They're going like, well, if they ask me to get in the office, I don't want to, because one, it means traveling to London. I'm not doing that. And two, it's like, well, because I know that I don't need to, right? Because it comes to this thing where it started off as like a forced thing, and a lot of companies would like to think that like, oh, it's a temporary thing, but I think it seems as almost like a benefit, as if you would expect like your laptop needs to be given to you, or like there's certain benefits from a company like health insurance if that's important to you. So I think obviously there's going to be companies that kind of go against that for whatever reason, but I think you sort of see, at least the people I talk to, that it's become like, if you think that you know your worth and you want it, you're going to demand it. And that's what I suppose my point is.
You said that you've been working as a designer for 12, 13 years. Is there anything from pre-COVID that you miss?
Really good point. I guess actually one thing, I was talking about it with our design team today, one thing that I miss that is becoming more and more clear is like, even though it's great moving fast and be able to do things really easily and like be able to spin stuff up, I actually miss the actual, in retrospect, I miss the time of like how sometimes like if you spend a long time planning or thinking something out, it's actually quite a good thing because you've got the time to really sit and digest something. And I kind of miss the level of chaos that sometimes in these like tag teams, even though I think they're a great idea, they can sometimes bring. I think like I kind of miss the, like everyone's trying to like put the like foot on the accelerator and no one's got it on the brake, right? Because it's so easy just to move like, oh, look how fast I'm going. But like what was quite good pre-COVID time is like, you could sit and think about something for a week, right? And now like a week's time just seems like huge. So I don't know if I miss it, or I think like maybe there's some balance to be struck, like there's some nice middle ground where you can still move quickly, but you don't have to like just be like, you know, driving blind, I guess. So yeah, I think it's one of those things in retrospect where like you don't realise the positives of something until they're not there anymore. Yeah.
Given your role and what the company you're working for, I'm kind of curious about like the AI adoption, and maybe you're not privy to it. I don't know, but I'm kind of really curious about like who's driving that in your customers or the corporations or organisations. Who's driving it? Is it the devs? Because obviously some devs are worried that it's going to take over their jobs. Some are leaning in. Is it from the top thinking this is going to be great? I get to have all my staff and make loads of money. I'm kind of curious around your observation on that.
Yeah, so probably give you a bit of biased opinion because we're essentially a company that's selling software that uses AI, right? So we do workflow automation, but a lot of that is like putting AI into certain things, building AI agents and things like that. So we're going to bias towards that, right? It's not really the sort of place you want to work if you don't like AI, right? Because you're building AI stuff, so it makes sense. But all that, the drive of that is all coming from like the core of the company. So we have like an unlimited AI budget, and you can spend as much as you want, basically, right? And you're encouraged to do it, but not in the way like if you don't use it, like you're gonna get in trouble. But it's kind of like if you're building an agent, you kind of want to use an agent so you know what to build, right? So it's kind of at the core of the company, and to be honest, like there's a few like everyone's kind of got their own opinions on it, but I don't think I've spoken to any of the engineers especially, and the designers who are all really like hardly any of the designers use Figma anymore. I think it's only me, to be honest. They're all like maybe sketching in it, but using like Claude Code to do interactive prototypes. So everyone's kind of all in on those things, and I don't think anyone I've spoken to is kind of worried that it's going to take their jobs because we've got such a heavy use. I personally think people see that the reason why it won't, because we see both the positives, but we also see a lot of the drawbacks that it's given us. Like a lot of the things that sometimes break certain things, or a lot of the kind of those teams that I was talking about earlier where they make sort of small prototypes, but actually you can see you're getting to 80%, and suddenly you see like I keep feeding stuff to Claude Code, for example, and this needs a person to come in and really tidy this up because it can only take me so far. So I think with heavy usage, I think the company's a lot more relaxed about it because there's not that fear of unknown. And I think it's like anything, I think the more you use these things, you realise like anyone who's talking like, oh, it's going to change, like no one's going to have jobs in 12 months is just talking out their arse, right? Like, but equally, I would say people who think this is nonsense, it'll go away, I think are equally like missing something. There's something there with it, but I don't think, none of our engineers, I think it's going to take all their jobs. Yeah.
Okay, speaking of AI agents, I know a lot of engineers now use AIs and writing their codes, but my concern is around PR reviews, because I encounter this problem a lot where you open a PR and the AI agent who's giving your PR just keep giving you a lot of issues like, oh, fix this, and you kind of iterating 10 comments, 11 comments, and it still keep repeating the same thing. So how are you able to balance using AI to write your code and then meeting another AI agent who is reviewing your code and they get conflicting themselves, like you have to go fix this, you use an agent in your code editor to fix this, and come back to the PR again and say, oh, there's still an issue again. So how do you handle this back and forth with this?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think it's like one of these things with anything changing, it's a problem that no one's massively solved yet. Our PRs are full of like 4 different code review agents giving you 4 different things, and sometimes, and I think, like anything like a new emerging technology, there's a lot of ideas that have been thrown out there, and I think when you look back, there'll probably be like a couple that make it and a couple that don't. So at the moment, it's just a bit of a wild west, but that's like anything, right? Like anything, you're trying new things out, you figure out things. So I know we have a lot of rules that we put in things. I was working on our design system yesterday actually, and I was like testing out a bunch of rules to try and enforce people use certain CSS variables rather than hard-coded things, and I tried loads of different ones, some worked, some didn't, and you kind of just have to tickle it in the right way, right? So I know if we use this AI tone review, that's really good for catching style bugs and visual bugs. This one's a lot better at catching more security-based things, so like, I don't think there's a set, like the market's set on like, this is the best way to do that yet, because they're so relatively new. So I think it's wide open for someone to come out with like the best solution that solves that problem, I think, because there's so many that do a lot of the same things, and some are better at some and some are better at others, in my opinion.
So on the agent side, how do you deal with the lack of sort of deep systemic knowledge that sort of happens when you're using LLMs to code features? I'll give you an example. If everyone used NeoFetch on Linux, just sort of outputs a bunch of different variables showing you sort of parameters of your system, there's a lot of different ways to get that information out. I've tried Codex and Claude and Gemini to see sort of what they show if I was building a NeoFetch clone. The problem is each one of them is using something completely different, and I'm never getting the right output from any of them. And again, I wrote this myself from scratch years ago, so I know where to look for that information, but each one of them is using something different because they're getting that information from GitHub or wherever.
Yeah.
So if I gave that to a new developer, they wouldn't be able to fix any of those because they wouldn't have that deep knowledge of sort of what they actually need to get to.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, in your specific circumstances, I don't know because I've not tried that specific thing. But I think what you're hitting on is like these things have limits. I think the problem I have with it is like we're constantly told by people selling these things that these things don't have any limits and you can do anything with them. Like I think it was like 6 months ago that the Anthropic team claimed that they created a C compiler with like they made it out in their marketing that they just went to Claude Code and said create a C compiler and left. Turns out basically they had to reprompt it. They did a lot of human written code as well. They gave a lot of tester using. There's a lot of things like that add a little limit to that. Now, I don't think that makes them useless. I just think it means like there's certain things that you find that they're good at and certain things you don't. And I think at least for me, like as a designer, I know that like I feel like they can do certain things with design, but I know they're not. It's going to be quicker or easier for me to just go in and do it than for me to prompt it and steer it in the right direction. So, but there's certain things that I find they're really good for like doing a lot of boring tasks that I don't want to do. Or like, I think we were talking earlier about like, if I have a bunch of rebase like conflicts, I can just get that to fix it when I don't have to spend like 3 hours going through everything. So I think it's really about having the right like framework of like what you think these things are doing are good for. And that I think is dependent on what project you're working on, what libraries you're working on, all that kind of stuff, what framework and like language you're working with. So I just think it's one of those things where don't expect to be good at everything, but also don't think just because it's not good at one thing, oh, it's shit, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's about finding out how they work for you and in your workflow and how useful they are as a tool rather than thinking they need to be used for everything. Yeah.
Douglas, you had sorry, we've got time for just last question. Paul, I know your questions, man. Maybe you can ask it in a part. How about that?
Okay, yeah, go on then.
Yeah. So Douglas.
How do you see the evolution of junior developer careers? Because there's been a huge shift. I had a conversation 18 months ago with the head of an IT department saying that the nascent AI tools at that time were replacing their junior developers.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest like worries. I think, like for example, like when I was talking about those job posting, like the hardest hit ones are like junior developers. And like, but then again, like I said, I haven't been a junior for ages, so it's easy for me to stand here as a senior person and go, oh yeah, just use it to learn, just do this and do that. I'd like to think that if I was a junior now, I'd try and be optimistic and think, well actually, if you think about it one way, I've got the best learning tool. Like I remember having to read like documentation to learn things, and it was so boring, and be like, no, you have to read it, otherwise you're never going to learn this stuff. Like, you've got this massive accelerant of doing things. But equally, it's so hard now to like find junior roles, right? I got my junior role just as a designer, just because I could code, and the guy thought, well, I don't have to hire 2 people, I could just hire this one guy and he could do both things. And yeah, I don't know, I don't really have a clear answer to like what's going to happen with that, but I suppose in some way, like you're going to have juniors because, you know, there needs to be new people, like, you know.
We need more seniors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's got to sort out. But it's like anything. I think it's just one of the challenges that like a lot of new technology is creating, and we're gonna have to figure out as an industry what we do about it. Like we can't just enjoy all the good things and just ignore all the drawbacks and trade-offs that it has.
Cool.
Cool.
Thank you very
Right,
much,
thank you
Rob.
guys.